In Clarksdale's town council chambers, a 74-year-old seamstress was about to make her final stand. What started as a routine municipal meeting took a shocking turn when she faced a councilman determined to demolish her life's work. Mae Jenkins wasn't your typical elderly resident. For 5 decades, she had fought for civil rights, known for her strategic mind and quiet determination. When Councilman Morrison dismissed her with, "The elderly don't understand modern realities," she had no idea this condescension would ignite a war. Mae's response would expose buried secrets and forgotten connections. What began as demolition, plans would become a battle for dignity itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Mae Jenkins had learned long ago that the back row of any meeting room offered the best vantage point for reading people. From her folding chair beside the radiator, she could see every council member's face, watch how they shifted when uncomfortable truths emerged, notice who avoided eye contact when votes were called. Tonight, she needed that advantage more than ever. The Clarksdale Town Council chambers buzzed with unusual energy. Word had spread about Derek Morrison's big announcement, and the room was packed beyond its normal capacity. Mae recognized most faces: shop owners, teachers, retirees who'd lived here their whole lives. But there were newer faces, too. People who'd moved to Clarksdale in recent years, drawn by the promise of revitalization that Morrison championed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who'd learned to command attention. At 42, he possessed the kind of confident bearing that made people believe he could deliver on his promises. "Tonight marks a turning point for our community. Tonight we stop clinging to the past and embrace the future." Mae's fingers tightened on the worn leather purse in her lap. She'd carried this same purse to voter registration meetings in 1965, to school board hearings when integration came to Clarksdale, to countless community gatherings where progress had been measured not in dollars, but in dignity. The weight of its contents, photographs, letters, documents she'd brought just in case, felt heavier tonight. Morrison clicked his laser pointer, and a glossy architectural rendering filled the projection screen. The proposed Clarksdale Commerce Center will bring 37 new businesses to our downtown area. Conservative estimates project 200 new jobs and an annual economic impact of $2 million. Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Mae watched faces light up with hope, with the promise of prosperity that had been elusive for too long in this Delta town. She understood their hunger for economic opportunity. What troubled her was what Morrison planned to feed it. "The optimal location for this development," Morrison continued, his pointer circling a familiar building on the screen, "requires the demolition of the current community center, a structure that, while historically significant to some, no longer serves the practical needs of a modern municipality." The words hit Mae like a physical blow, though she kept her expression neutral. Historically significant to some, as if the Clarksdale Community Center was merely a sentimental artifact, rather than the living heart of this community's struggle for justice and dignity. Pastor Samuel Washington shifted uncomfortably in the third row. Mae caught his eye briefly, saw the conflict there. Sam had baptized 3 of her grandchildren in the center's fellowship hall during the years when his church was being rebuilt, after the fire. He knew what that building meant. But Sam had always been careful, diplomatic. He wouldn't make waves unless absolutely necessary. "Council members, I move for a vote to approve the Commerce Center development plan, including the necessary demolition of the community center," Morrison announced. "The timeline is aggressive but achievable. We can break ground in 90 days if we act decisively tonight." Mae's heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing remained steady. 90 days. That was Morrison's first mistake, revealing his timeline before gauging opposition. It told her this wasn't just about economic development. There was urgency here, pressure from somewhere that made him rush. Council Chairman Bill Matthews called for public comment. Ruby Mae watched 3 business owners speak in favor of the proposal. Their arguments sound but predictable. Jobs, tax revenue, progress. When the opposition's turn came, only 2 people rose. Mrs. Chen from the Historical Society spoke about architectural preservation, but her voice wavered, her arguments academic rather than emotional. Then Ruby Mae stood. The room's energy shifted as she made her way to the podium, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the worn linoleum. At 74, she moved with deliberate purpose rather than speed, but there was something in her bearing that commanded attention. She'd learned long ago that authority came not from volume, but from certainty. "Council members," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I am Ruby Mae Jenkins. I have lived in Clarksdale for 74 years. I helped build that community center with my own hands in 1963. She paused, letting her eyes move across the council. Table cataloging reactions. Morrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected personal testimony, historical witness. "That building isn't just a structure. It's where we organized voter registration drives when some folks thought certain citizens didn't deserve that right. It's where we fed families during the flood of 73. It's where 3 generations of our children learned to read, learned their worth, learned they had voices that mattered." Morrison leaned forward, his media-trained smile firmly in place. "Mrs. Jenkins, we all appreciate the center's historical value. But we must balance sentiment with economic reality. The proposal includes provisions for a historical marker commemorating—" "A marker?" Ruby Mae's voice didn't rise, but something in its tone made the room go silent. "You want to replace the place where Dr. King spoke in 1965 with a plaque? Replace the hall where we planned the integration of Clarksdale High with a commemorative sign?" The silence stretched. Ruby Mae watched Morrison's expression, saw the moment when he realized she wasn't just another concerned senior citizen with fuzzy memories. She had facts. She had history he probably didn't even know existed. But Morrison recovered quickly, his political instincts kicking in. "Mrs. Jenkins, I understand this is emotional for you. Change is always difficult, especially for folks who've seen so much of it over the years." His tone carried the patronizing gentleness typically reserved for children and the elderly. "But we can't let nostalgia prevent us from giving our young people opportunities for the future." The dismissal was surgical, designed to make her seem like an obstacle to progress rather than a keeper of important memory. Ruby Mae felt the familiar sting of being rendered invisible, her lifetime of experience reduced to mere sentiment. Around the room, she saw people shifting uncomfortably, some nodding along with Morrison's reasonable-sounding rebuke. "Perhaps," Morrison continued, his confidence growing, "your energy might be better focused on activities more suited to, well, to folks in your stage of life. Garden clubs, perhaps, book circles. Things that don't require getting tangled up in complex municipal planning." The condescension hung in the air like smoke. Ruby Mae felt every eye in the room on her, saw some faces filled with sympathy, others with agreement that she was simply out of her depth. She recognized the moment for what it was, not just a personal insult, but a demonstration for the entire community about whose voices mattered and whose could be safely ignored. "Thank you for your input, Mrs. Jenkins," Chairman Matthews said, quickly, clearly wanting to move past the awkward moment. "Is there any other public comment?" Ruby Mae returned to her seat without another word, but her mind was spinning with calculations. She cataloged which council members had looked uncomfortable during Morrison's dismissal, which had nodded approval. She noted who in the audience had watched her with respect versus pity. She filed away Morrison's body language, his word choices, The slight flush that suggested her historical references had landed somewhere sensitive. The vote was swift and predictable. 4 in favor, 1 abstention. Pastor Washington had abstained rather than vote against her, which was something, though. Not enough. 90 days until demolition. 90 days to prove that some things were worth more than their immediate economic value. As the meeting adjourned, Ruby Mae gathered her purse and rose slowly, accepting offers of help she didn't need. People approached with gentle words of sympathy, treating her like a brave but defeated old woman who'd fought the good fight and lost. Their kindness was genuine, but misplaced. They had no idea the fight hadn't even begun. Morrison worked the room with practiced ease, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. When he approached Ruby Mae near the exit, his expression was carefully compassionate. "Mrs. Jenkins, I hope you understand this wasn't personal. The town needs to move forward, and sometimes that means making hard choices." Ruby Mae looked up at him with eyes that held depths he couldn't fathom. "Mr. Morrison, I've been making hard choices since before you were born. I understand exactly what this is." She walked out into the humid Mississippi night, where cicadas sang their ancient chorus and the scent of magnolias mixed with the river's muddy promise. Behind her, the community center sat in darkness, waiting. Morrison thought he'd won something. Tonight. He thought he'd neutralized an old woman's sentimental objections. He had no idea he'd just awakened something far more dangerous than sentiment. Ruby Mae Jenkins had spent a lifetime learning when to speak and when to listen, when to bend and when to stand firm. She'd organized in shadows during the civil rights era, raised 6 children while building a business, navigated decades of change without losing her sense of who she was or what mattered. Morrison had made 2 critical errors tonight. First, he'd underestimated her. Second, he'd given her 90 days. That would be more than enough time to show them exactly what they were about to lose, and exactly what she was still capable of protecting. What I'd show them. Part 2. Gathering the threads. The cicadas had quieted by the time Ruby Mae reached Magnolia Street. Morrison's condescending words still echoed. Activities more suited to folks in your stage of life. But the sting had sharpened into focus. She'd felt this dismissal before, in 1965 when the registrar told her not to worry her pretty little head about voting. The same certainty that her voice didn't matter. They'd learn differently this time, too. Dot Franklin's Victorian house glowed with warm light despite the midnight hour. Ruby Mae's oldest friend had always been a night owl, and she suspected Dot had been waiting. The door opened before Ruby Mae could knock. "Saw the council meeting live stream," Dot said, stepping aside. At 68, Dolores Franklin moved. With the brisk efficiency of someone who'd managed 40 years of elementary chaos. Her silver hair held the same practical bun from her librarian days, eyes sharp with intelligence that had made her legendary among 3 generations of students. "That man has no idea what he stepped in," Dot continued, leading Ruby Mae toward the back room. "Coffee's fresh. We've got work to do." Ruby Mae had expected sympathy. She hadn't expected Dot rolling up her sleeves for battle. The back room was Dot's archive. Filing cabinets lined walls, shelves held document boxes, and photographs covered a large central table. For 20 years since retirement, Dot had collected, organized, and preserved Clarksdale's unofficial history. What official records missed, what newspapers feared to print, what people whispered in beauty salons, Dot had saved it all. Morrison thinks he knows this town's history, Dot said, pulling out a thick folder marked Community Center, 1963-1970. He wants to reduce 60 years of struggle to a commemorative plaque. Let's show him real history. She spread photographs across the table like playing cards. Ruby Mae's breath caught as decades collapsed. There she was at 22, victory rolls framing her face, hammer in hand beside a pile of lumber. The community center's frame rising behind her, raw wood and hope made manifest. "I'd forgotten this one," Ruby Mae whispered. I never forget anything, Dot said with satisfaction. Look here. The next photograph showed Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at a makeshift podium in the unfinished hall. Exposed wires hung from incomplete walls, but the room packed with people. Ruby Mae found herself in the crowd, young and fierce, eyes fixed on the man teaching them that dignity was a right to be claimed, not granted. September 15th, 1965, Dot said. 3 weeks before official completion. Original venue backed out last minute, but we had roof and walls. That was enough. Ruby Mae's fingers trembled, touching the photograph. Morrison had mentioned Dr. King dismissively, calling it mere nostalgia. He had no idea what that night meant, how that speech galvanized the entire county's civil rights movement. There's more. Dot opened another folder. Financial records, meeting minutes, correspondence. Ruby Mae, that building wasn't just where we organized, it was command central. Voter registration, integration strategies, economic boycotts, everything. They worked in silence for an hour, sorting documents that told the center's real story. Ruby Mae felt tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying begin to loosen. Here was proof her memories weren't sentimental reminiscences. Here was evidence that Morrison's target had been the birthplace of justice in their corner of Mississippi. A car door slammed outside. Nearly 1 a.m., too late for casual visitors. Expecting someone? Ruby Mae asked. Dot moved to the front window, expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Oh, Lord, it's Keisha. Ruby Mae's granddaughter strode up the walk with determined purpose, phone pressed to her ear. Even in porch light, Ruby Mae could see tight shoulders, the set jaw that meant trouble. At 35, Keisha had inherited the Jenkins stubborn streak, but where Ruby Mae had learned strategic channeling, Keisha wielded it like a blunt instrument. "Grandmama?" Keisha called through the door, voice carrying that particular tone meaning Ruby Mae was in trouble. "I know you're in there, Mrs. Franklin. Please open up." "How did she—" Ruby Mae started. "Find my iPhone," Keisha called, as if hearing the question. "Modern technology, Grandmama. You thought you could disappear after that stunt tonight?" Ruby Mae sighed, moving to unlock the door. "It wasn't a stunt, baby girl. It was democracy." Keisha pushed past into the hallway, still clutching her phone. She was dressed for Memphis professional life even at this hour. Crisp blouse, tailored pants, sleek hair. Everything screamed success, competence, control. Everything except her eyes, which held the particular mix of fear and frustration Ruby Mae remembered from Keisha's teenage years. "Democracy?" Keisha's voice rose. "Grandmama, you made a spectacle on live stream. Do you know how many people saw that? What they're saying about our family online?" "What are they saying?" Ruby Mae asked mildly. Keisha scrolled through her phone. "That you're a sweet old lady who doesn't understand progress. That it's sad when elderly people can't accept change. That your family should be taking better care of you." Her voice cracked on the last part. Ruby Mae felt the familiar pang of generational misunderstanding. Keisha lived where reputation was measured in likes and shares, where public embarrassment followed you forever in digital permanence. She couldn't understand that some fights were worth looking foolish. "And what do you think?" Ruby Mae asked. "I think you're going to get hurt," Keisha said, professional composure cracking. "I think you're tilting at windmills, and Morrison will make you look like a confused old woman if you keep this up." The words hung between them. Ruby Mae saw Dot stiffen, protective instincts engaging. But she also saw something else in Keisha's face. Not just embarrassment, but genuine fear. Fear that her grandmother was losing her grip. Fear that the family name would be tarnished. Fear that she was watching someone she loved make a terrible mistake. "Keisha," Ruby Mae said gently, "come sit. Let me show you something." She led her granddaughter into the archive room, where photographs still covered the table. Keisha's expression shifted as she took in the organized chaos of historical documents. decades of careful preservation. "What is all this?" "Your inheritance," Ruby Mae said, picking up Dr. King's photograph. "The story Morrison wants to bury under his strip mall." Keisha studied the image, business-trained eye taking in details. "Is that really September 15th, 1965, Dot confirmed. "Your grandmother was front row when he spoke about organized action's power." "Why didn't I know about this?" Keisha's voice was smaller now, confused rather than angry. Ruby Mae felt the weight of untold stories, history she'd assumed would somehow transfer itself without effort. "Because you never asked, baby girl. Because you were building your own life and I was proud. Because I thought the past could take care of itself." "But this is important. This is real history." "It is," Ruby Mae agreed. "And tomorrow morning, Morrison starts erasing it forever." Footsteps on the front porch interrupted them. 2 visitors in one night was unusual. 3 was suspicious. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Mrs. Franklin?" a young male voice called. "Sorry to bother you so late. It's Marcus Thompson from the community center. I saw lights and I need to talk to someone about tonight." Marcus Thompson stood on the porch like someone who'd been walking for hours. At 19, he had the lanky frame of someone still growing. Into his height, Delta State University sweatshirt wrinkled like he'd been sleeping in it. But his eyes held intensity suggesting sleep had been impossible. "I tried going back to my room after the meeting," he said as Dot let him in. "But I couldn't stop thinking about what Mr. Morrison said, about the center, about how he talked to Mrs. Jenkins." His eyes found Ruby Mae. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize for not speaking up, for just sitting there while he dismissed you." Ruby Mae studied his face, reading genuine distress. Another assumption challenged. She'd figured college students saw people her age as irrelevant obstacles. But here he was at 1 a.m., troubled enough by injustice to seek out strangers. "You didn't owe me anything in that room, son," she said gently. "Yes, I did," Marcus said firmly. "That center isn't just some old building. I see them every day. Kids doing homework at computers, seniors playing cards, families using meeting rooms for birthday parties they can't afford elsewhere." He paused, gathering thoughts. "My grandmother told me stories about that place. Voter registration drives, community meetings during integration. She said it saved this neighborhood." "What was your grandmother's name?" Dot asked quietly. "Loretta Thompson. She passed last year." Dot moved to a filing cabinet, pulling out voter registration, 1964-1968. She flipped through handwritten names until finding what she sought. Loretta Thompson, registered March 15, 1965. Address, 412 Cotton Street. Marcus's eyes widened. That was her address, her whole life. Ruby Mae felt something shift in the room, past and present connecting unexpectedly. This young man wasn't just a college student who happened to work at the center. He was connected to their shared history in ways none had realized. "Marcus," she said, "how much do you know about the center's real history?" "Not enough," he admitted. "Grandmama told stories, but I was young and didn't always listen like I should have." Ruby Mae saw Keisha nod, shared recognition of generational blindness, of taking family history for granted until almost too late. "What if I told you we have 90 days to save that building and we need all the help we can get?" Marcus straightened, and Ruby Mae could see the man he was becoming. "What do you need me to do?" It was nearly 3 a.m. when they separated, but Ruby Mae felt more energized than she had in years. They had the beginning of a plan now. Dot would organize historical documentation. Keisha would research Morrison's background and business connections. Marcus would be their eyes and ears at the center itself. And Ruby Mae would do what she'd always done best: listen, watch, and think. She would map connections between past and present, between official story and hidden truth. She would find pressure points that made Morrison vulnerable and allies who could be convinced to stand with them. Walking home through quiet Clarksdale streets, Ruby Mae thought about that photograph of herself at 22, hammer in hand, building something meant to last. She'd been naive then, believing progress was permanent, that victories once won couldn't be taken away. Now she knew better. Every generation had to fight the same battles over again, in new forms, but with the same essential stakes. The question wasn't whether the fight was worth it. The question was whether she still had strength to see it through. Behind her, the community center sat in darkness, waiting. Morrison thought he had 90 days to tear it down. Ruby Mae Jenkins had 90 days to prove him wrong. Ruby Mae found Elena Rodriguez at Mama Lou's diner the next morning, laptop open. Beside her, untouched eggs and grits. The young journalist sat hunched over her screen with the focused intensity of someone chasing a deadline. Dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, notepad covered in shorthand that looked like hieroglyphics. "Miss Rodriguez?" Ruby Mae approached the booth carefully, reading the woman's body language. Elena looked up with the guarded expression of someone interrupted mid-thought. "Mrs. Jenkins, right? From last night's meeting." Elena's voice carried a slight accent. California, Ruby Mae guessed. She'd learned to place voices over the years, the way some people collected stamps. "Please sit. I was actually hoping to talk with you." Ruby Mae settled into the worn vinyl booth, studying Elena's face. 29, according to the byline. Ruby Mae had found in the local paper. Recent journalism school graduate, assigned to cover local interest stories while hoping for bigger assignments. The kind of young professional who saw small-town Mississippi as a stepping stone rather than a destination. "I suppose you want to write about the crazy old lady tilting at windmills," Ruby Mae said, testing the waters. Elena's expression shifted, surprise replacing professional politeness. "Actually, I was thinking more about the community center's historical significance. Your mention of Dr. King speaking there, that's not in any of the official records I could find." Interesting. Ruby Mae had expected a human interest piece about elderly residents resisting change. She hadn't expected someone who'd done homework. "Official records miss a lot of things," Ruby Mae said carefully, "especially from that era. Some stories weren't safe to write down." Elena leaned forward, journalist instincts engaging. "What kind of stories?" Ruby Mae studied the young woman's face, looking for the telltale signs of someone who already had their narrative figured out. But Elena's expression held genuine curiosity, the kind of open attention that couldn't be faked. "The kind that could get people killed in 1965, Ruby Mae said quietly. "The kind that explain why a building matters more than the bricks it's made from." She reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph Dot had given her. The image of Dr. King at the makeshift podium, the unfinished walls of the community center visible behind him. Elena's eyes widened as she took in the details. When was this taken?" "September 15th, 1965. 3 weeks before the center was officially completed. Dr. King wasn't supposed to speak here. The original venue canceled at the last minute. Death threats, you understand. But we had walls and a roof, and that was enough." Elena pulled out her phone, photographing the image. "Why wasn't this documented? This is significant civil rights history." "Because documenting it would have meant painting a target on everyone in that room," Ruby Mae explained. "Because some of us had children to protect and jobs to lose. Because survival sometimes meant staying invisible." The diner's bell chimed as Marcus Thompson pushed through the door, scanning the room until he spotted Ruby Mae's booth. The young man looked like he'd slept poorly. Wrinkled clothes, uncertain expression, the kind of nervous energy that came from staying up all night thinking. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to tell you something. About the center." Elena looked between them with professional interest. Ruby Mae made a quick decision. Marcus, this is Elena Rodriguez from the paper. Elena, Marcus. Thompson. He works at the community center. Marcus slid into the booth beside Elena, his nervousness shifting to determination. I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the center's history, about my grandmother's stories. I want to help, but I need to understand what I'm fighting for. What do you know about your grandmother's involvement? Elena asked, her reporter's instincts automatically taking over. Not enough, Marcus admitted. She used to tell me about voter registration drives, about community meetings during integration. But I was young, and He trailed off, the universal regret of not listening to elders while they were still alive. Ruby Mae pulled out another photograph, this one, showing a group of young people, including a woman who looked remarkably like Marcus around the eyes. Is this her? Loretta Thompson? Marcus's breath caught. Yes, but she looks so young. She was young, Ruby Mae said. We all were. Your grandmother was one of the bravest people I knew. She registered voters when it meant risking everything. Elena was taking notes rapidly, her initial skepticism replaced by growing excitement. This is a much bigger story than I thought. The demolition isn't just about economic development, it's about erasing civil rights history. Now you're beginning to understand, Ruby Mae said. The diner bell chimed again, and Pastor Samuel Washington entered, his usually confident bearing, slightly uncertain. He spotted their booth and approached with the careful steps of someone unsure of his welcome. Ruby Mae, he said, I was hoping to find you. We need to talk. The booth was getting crowded, but Elena scooted over to make room. Sam settled in with the slight awkwardness of someone who usually commanded rather than joined conversations. About last night, he began, I want you to know that my abstention I wasn't abandoning you. I was trying to keep the church out of politics. And how's that working out for you? Ruby Mae asked, not unkindly. Sam's expression tightened. Morrison came to see me this morning. Wanted to discuss the church's continued use of the community center. Made it clear that our lease renewal might depend on our position regarding the development. Elena looked up from her notes. That sounds like coercion. It sounds like Derek Morrison, Ruby Mae said, grimly. Did he threaten anything specific? He didn't have to. The implication was clear enough. Support the demolition or find somewhere else to hold services while we rebuild our sanctuary. Marcus leaned forward. How many people depend on services at the center? Not just church, but all the programs? Dozens of families, Sam said. Senior lunches, after-school programs, community meetings. The center isn't just a building. It's the heart of this neighborhood. Ruby Mae watched Elena scribbling notes, saw the journalist's expression shifting from professional interest to personal investment. The story was changing shape before Elena's eyes, growing from a simple development controversy into something much more complex. Elena, Ruby Mae said, what kind of story are you planning to write? Elena looked up from her notepad, meeting Ruby Mae's steady gaze. Honestly, I came here thinking I'd write about elderly residents struggling with change. A human interest piece about nostalgia versus progress. And now? Now I'm thinking about corruption, about civil rights history being deliberately erased, about communities being destroyed for profit. Elena's voice carried a new edge. This isn't a human interest story. This is investigative journalism. Ruby Mae felt something settle in her chest, the satisfaction of recognition. Elena Rodriguez wasn't just another young professional looking for her big break. She was someone who could see the difference between a story and the truth. If you're serious about investigating, Ruby Mae said, you should know that Morrison's timeline doesn't make sense. 90 days from council vote to demolition? That's not how municipal projects work. What are you thinking? I'm thinking someone's putting pressure on him, and I'm thinking Elena Rodriguez might be exactly the person to find out who. Marcus spoke up suddenly. There's something else. I work at the center, so I see the mail, the visitor logs. Morrison's been there 3 times in the past month, always with men in expensive suits, always when he thought no one was watching. Elena's pen moved rapidly across her notepad. Did you recognize any of them? No, but I can describe them, and I still have the visitor logs. Ruby Mae looked around the table at the unlikely alliance forming over cold coffee and untouched breakfast. A retired seamstress, a young journalist, a college student, and a conflicted pastor. Not exactly the coalition she'd envisioned, but something was building here. Something that felt like possibility. So, she said, where do we start? Elena closed her laptop with decision. We start by finding out who Derek Morrison really works for. And then we find out why they want that building gone so badly they're willing to bribe, threaten, and lie to get it. The morning sun slanted through Mama Lou's windows, casting long shadows across their table. Ruby Mae thought about another morning, 58 years ago, when she'd sat in a different diner making plans that would change everything. The faces were different now, the stakes perhaps smaller in the grand scheme of history. But the feeling was the same. The quiet electricity that came before a storm, the moment when ordinary people decided to become something more. Morrison thought he was fighting confused elderly residents and sentimental nostalgia. He had no idea he'd awakened something far more dangerous. The alliance between memory and truth, between those who remembered and those who refused to forget. The morning sun had burned off the Delta mist by the time Ruby Mae returned home to find Keisha, pacing her front porch like a caged animal. Her granddaughter still wore yesterday's Memphis professional attire, but the crisp edges had wilted into wrinkled exhaustion. We need to talk, Keisha said without preamble, her phone clutched in white-knuckled fingers. Right now. Ruby Mae unlocked the front door, noting the tight set of Keisha's shoulders, the way her eyes darted to the street as if expecting cameras. Coffee's probably cold, but I can make fresh. I don't want coffee, Grandmama. I want you to stop this embarrassing crusade before it gets worse. The words hung between them as they entered Ruby Mae's modest living room, where photographs of 5 generations of Jenkins family watched from every surface. Ruby Mae settled into her favorite chair, the one that had been her husband's, worn smooth by 40 years of evening conversations. Embarrassing to who, baby girl? Keisha's composure cracked. To me, to our family. Do you know I had 17 missed calls this morning? 17. Clients asking if my grandmother is the confused elderly woman they saw on social media. My boss wanting to know if I need family leave to handle your situation. Ruby Mae felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a problem that needed handling. And what did you tell them? I told them you were going through a difficult time, that the family was taking care of it. Keisha's voice dropped to a whisper. I called Morrison's office, Grandmama. I asked them what it would take to make this go away quietly. The betrayal hit Ruby Mae like a physical blow. She'd expected opposition from strangers, condescension from politicians. She hadn't expected her own granddaughter to negotiate her surrender behind her back. What did they tell you? That if you issued a public statement supporting the development, acknowledged that you'd been emotional and hadn't understood the full economic benefits, they'd be happy to name the commemorative plaque after you. Ruby Mae closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generational trauma that shaped their family. Keisha, do you know why your grandmother never talked about the old days? Why she changed the subject when people asked about integration, about the voter drives? Because it was painful. Because she wanted to move forward, not backward. Because she was tired, Ruby Mae said quietly. Tired of fighting, tired of being afraid, tired of watching her children navigate a world that saw them as less than. She thought if she stayed quiet, kept her head down, built a good life for her family, that would be enough. Keisha sat on the edge of the sofa, her phone silent for the first time all morning. Wasn't it? For her generation, maybe, but that silence came with a cost. Stories untold, history forgotten, victories erased. Your mother grew up thinking the civil rights movement was something that happened to other people, in other places. And you, Ruby Mae's voice caught. You grew up thinking your family history started when you went to college. That's not fair, isn't it? You called Morrison to make this go away quietly, just like they wanted us to go away quietly in 1965. Just like they want all of us to go away quietly now. Keisha's professional mask slipped completely. I'm scared, Grandmama. Scared you're going to get hurt. Scared you're going to make enemies we can't handle. Scared people will think that you're losing your mind. The honesty broke Ruby Mae's heart and strengthened her resolve simultaneously. Baby girl, my mind is clearer than it's been in years. And the only way I'll get hurt is if I let them convince me I don't matter. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elena. Morrison's development company has ties to offshore investment. Need to meet? This is bigger than we thought. Ruby Mae showed Keisha the message. Elena Rodriguez is investigating Morrison's business connections. Would you rather I face this alone, or would you rather help me understand what we're really fighting? Keisha stared at the phone screen, her internal conflict playing across her face. If I help you, if this gets bigger, my career could be over. If you don't help me, Ruby Mae said gently, your heritage already is. Outside, a mockingbird called from the magnolia tree that had shaded this house since before Ruby Mae was born. 4 generations of Jenkins women had sat beneath its branches, making hard choices about when to speak and when to stay silent, when to fight and when to survive. Ruby Mae stood and offered her hand to her granddaughter. Come on, baby girl. Let me show you what Elena found. Elena Rodriguez had transformed the back corner of the public library into a war room. Papers covered every inch of the long table, laptop screens glowed with spreadsheets and corporate filings, and a whiteboard displayed a web of connections that looked like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. When Ruby Mae and Keisha arrived, Elena was hunched over printouts with the intensity of someone who'd discovered something that changed everything. Thank you for coming, Elena said, looking up with eyes that held both excitement and concern. Especially you, Keisha. Your social media research skills might be exactly what we need. Keisha hung back near the table's edge, still uncertain about her involvement. What did you find? Elena pulled out a thick folder. Morrison's development company, Delta Progress LLC, is funded by something called Meridian Holdings, which is owned by Coastal Development Partners, which is controlled by Atlantic Investment Group. She paused, letting the chain of corporate shells sink in. All of them registered in the Cayman Islands. Ruby Mae felt her stomach tighten. Shell companies. Exactly. Someone is going to extraordinary lengths to hide their identity, but that's not the worst part. Elena flipped to another page. 3 of the 5 town council members who voted for demolition, they each received consulting fees from various subsidiaries of this corporate maze in the past 6 months. Bribes, Keisha said quietly. Legal bribes, Elena corrected. Consulting contracts for economic development planning and municipal growth strategies. Perfectly legitimate on paper, completely corrupt in practice. Ruby Mae studied the financial documents, recognizing the pattern from her decades of community organizing. They're not just buying the council vote, they're buying the entire process. Marcus appeared at their table, slightly out of breath. Sorry I'm late. I brought the visitor logs from the center. He spread out photocopied pages covered in signatures and dates. Look at this. Morrison's been meeting with the same 3 people for weeks. Always after hours, always when he thought no one was watching. Elena compared the visitor logs to her corporate research. John Hartwell signed in as architectural consultant, but he's actually the CEO of Coastal Development Partners. Robert. Chen, listed as environmental assessor, but he's the legal counsel for Atlantic Investment Group. What about the third man? Ruby Mae asked. Marcus pointed to a scrawled signature. Thomas Bradley. He just wrote investor next to his name. Elena's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard. Thomas Bradley. Here he is. Senior partner at Bradley, Wyatt & Associates, one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the Southeast. And look at this. She turned her screen toward them. Bradley's firm has been quietly buying up property around the community center for the past year. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Ruby Mae had seen this pattern before, during urban renewal in the 1970s when entire neighborhoods disappeared under the guise of progress. They're not just building a strip mall, she said. They're assembling a much larger development. The community center is the last piece they need. Keisha leaned forward, her business training engaging despite her reservations. But why all the secrecy? Why not just make a fair offer for the property? Because the community center sits on the most valuable corner in downtown Clarksdale, Elena explained. River access, highway frontage, historic district tax advantages. Plus, if people knew the real scope of what they're planning, there would be organized opposition. Ruby Mae felt the old familiar anger rising. Not the hot rage of youth, but the cold fury of someone who'd seen this game played too many times. They're counting on us being too old, too poor, too divided to fight back effectively. There's more, Elena said, her voice dropping. I did some digging into Morrison's background. His MBA program was funded by a scholarship from, guess who? Atlantic Investment Group. He's been their inside man from the beginning. The silence stretched as the implications sank in. Morrison wasn't just an ambitious politician who'd been corrupted. He was a planted asset, carefully positioned to deliver Clarksdale's downtown to outside investors. How long have you known? Keisha asked Elena. I started connecting the dots yesterday afternoon, but I needed to verify everything before making accusations. These are serious allegations. Ruby Mae studied the web of connections Elena had, mapped out, thinking about timing and strategy. When are you planning to publish this? That's what I wanted to discuss with you. Publishing too early could give them time to cover their tracks or accelerate their timeline, but waiting too long risks letting them complete the demolition. What do you recommend? Elena's expression was grim. I think we have one shot to expose this properly. Morrison is holding another community meeting tomorrow night, supposedly to address concerns about the development. If we present all this evidence there, in front of the entire community, they won't be able to spin it or bury it. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. The meeting's at the community center itself. Everyone will be there. The full council, Morrison, probably some of his investors. It's risky, Ruby Mae said. If we're wrong about any of this. We're not wrong, Elena said firmly. I've triple-checked every connection, verified every document. This is solid investigative journalism. Keisha had been quiet during the discussion, but now she spoke up. What do you need from me? Ruby Mae looked at her granddaughter with surprise and hope. You're willing to help? I'm terrified, Keisha admitted. But I'm more terrified of living in a world where people like Morrison can destroy our history, for profit, and get away with it. She turned to Elena. What can I do? Social media amplification. If we're going to expose this tomorrow night, we need to make sure the story spreads faster than they can contain it. Live tweeting, Facebook posts, Instagram stories, everything. I can do that, Keisha said with growing confidence. I can make sure this goes viral before they know what hit them. Ruby Mae felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the electric anticipation of a well-planned campaign about to launch. They had the evidence, they had the platform, and now they had the team. There's something else we need to consider, she said. Morrison and his investors think they're dealing with a confused old woman and a handful of sentimental locals. Tomorrow night, we're going to show them exactly what they're really up against. Elena began gathering her documents. Ruby Mae, are you sure you want to be the one presenting this? The backlash could be intense. Ruby Mae thought about Morrison's condescending dismissal, about the generations of struggle that had built the community center, about the future that hung in the balance. She thought about Dr. King standing at that makeshift podium in 1965, teaching them that dignity was not granted, but claimed. Elena, she said, I've been preparing for this moment my entire life. Let me show them what an old woman who doesn't understand modern realities can actually accomplish. The library's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they finalized their plans for tomorrow night. Morrison thought he had 90 days to tear down the community center. He had less than 24 hours before Ruby Mae Jenkins tore down everything he'd built instead. The Clarksdale Community Center hadn't seen a crowd this size since the integration rallies of 1966. Every folding chair was occupied, people lined the walls, and late arrivals spilled out onto the front steps. Ruby Mae sat in the front row, the same leather purse in her lap, watching Morrison work the room with practiced political charm. He moved through the crowd like a man confident of victory, shaking hands and making promises about jobs and prosperity. He had no idea what was coming. Pastor Washington opened the meeting with a prayer that seemed to linger longer than usual, his words about truth and justice carrying weight that made several council members shift uncomfortably. When he finished, Morrison took the makeshift podium, the same spot where Dr. King had spoken 58 years earlier. Friends and neighbors, Morrison began, his voice carrying that familiar, smooth confidence. I called this meeting to address some concerns that have been raised about our downtown development project. I want to make sure everyone understands the tremendous opportunities we're creating for Clarksdale's future. Ruby Mae listened as Morrison painted his vision of progress: new businesses, increased tax revenue, job creation for young people who might otherwise leave Mississippi for opportunities elsewhere. His arguments were polished, his statistics impressive, his passion seemingly genuine. Around the room, she watched faces nodding along with his reasonable-sounding plans. Now, Morrison continued, I know some folks have sentimental attachments to this old building. Change is never easy, especially for our senior community members who've seen so much transformation over the years. But we can't let nostalgia prevent us from giving our children and grandchildren the future they deserve. Ruby Mae felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but this time it felt different. This time she was ready. Marcus had positioned himself near the back of the room, his phone discreetly recording. Keisha sat 3 rows behind Ruby Mae, her laptop open, fingers poised over the keyboard. Elena was in the side aisle, camera ready, notepad filled with questions that would expose everything they'd discovered. I'd like to invite community input, Morrison said, scanning the room with calculated magnanimity. This is your chance to ask questions, share concerns, and learn more about how this development will benefit everyone. 3 people stood to speak in favor of the project. A young mother worried about job opportunities, a shop owner excited about increased foot traffic, a retiree concerned about property values. Their arguments were heartfelt and genuine, and Ruby Mae understood their hopes. What they didn't understand was how they were being manipulated. Then Mrs. Patterson from the Historical Society rose, her voice trembling as she spoke about architectural preservation. Mr. Williams, who'd run the corner barber shop for 40 years, talked about community character and the importance of local businesses. Both were respectful, thoughtful, and easily dismissed by Morrison's smooth rebuttals about progress and economic reality. Ruby Mae waited, letting Morrison gain confidence, letting him think he was winning. She watched him relax into his rhythm, saw his political instincts telling him this was going exactly as planned. Finally, she stood. The room quieted as she made her way to the podium, her cane tapping a steady rhythm on the worn linoleum. Morrison stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, his smile firmly in place, probably expecting another emotional plea about memories and sentiment. Instead, Ruby Mae placed Elena's research folder on the podium and looked out at the packed room with the calm authority of someone who'd been waiting her entire life for this moment. "My name is Ruby Mae Jenkins," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "I'm 74 years old, and I helped build this community center with my own hands in 1963. Mr. Morrison has suggested that people my age don't understand modern economic realities. Tonight, I'm going to show him exactly what this old woman understands." She opened the folder and pulled out the first document, the corporate filing that showed Delta Progress LLC's connection to Meridian Holdings. "Mr. Morrison's development company receives its funding from a chain of shell corporations registered in the Cayman Islands," she said matter-of-factly. "Companies designed to hide the identity of the real investors behind this project." Morrison's confident smile faltered slightly. "Mrs. Jenkins, I'm not sure where you're getting this information, but—" "I'm getting it from public records," Ruby Mae interrupted, her voice still calm but carrying steel underneath. "Records that show your investors have been secretly buying property around this center for over a year. Records that show 3 of our council members received consulting fees from subsidiaries of these same shell companies." A murmur ran through the crowd. Morrison's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. "These are serious accusations, Mrs. Jenkins. I hope you have documentation to support." "I do." Ruby Mae pulled out Elena's financial research, holding up bank records and consulting contracts. "Councilman Williams received $12,000 for a municipal planning consultation. Councilwoman Thompson got $15,000 for economic development advisory services. Councilman Martinez was paid $8,000 for demographic analysis." The named council members were shifting in their seats, their expressions ranging from panic to anger. Chairman Matthews was frantically whispering to the city attorney. "But that's not the most interesting part," Ruby Mae continued, pulling out Morrison's scholarship records. "The most interesting part is that Derek Morrison's MBA program was funded by a scholarship from Atlantic Investment Group, the same company that ultimately controls the shell corporations buying up our downtown." Morrison stepped forward, his political training kicking in. "Mrs. Jenkins, even if these financial connections exist, they don't change the fundamental benefits this development will bring to our community. We're talking about jobs, economic growth. We're talking—" "About a lie," Ruby Mae said, her voice rising for the first time. "You've been telling this community you want to build a strip mall, but your investors have been assembling parcels for a massive development that will stretch 6 blocks in every direction. You need this building gone not because it's obsolete, but because it's the last piece of property you can't buy." She pulled out the final document, Bradley's real estate firm's master development plan, obtained through Elena's investigative work. A luxury hotel, high-end condominiums, upscale, retail that will price out every local business owner in this room. Your investors aren't interested in helping Clarksdale. They're interested in replacing it with something that serves tourists and wealthy outsiders. The room erupted. Voices rose in anger, confusion, and betrayal. Morrison was speaking rapidly, trying to regain control, but his words were lost in the chaos. Ruby Mae watched it all with satisfaction, seeing the moment when a community realized it had been lied to. Pastor Washington stood, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. "Let Mrs. Jenkins finish." The room quieted again, and Ruby Mae felt the power of the moment, hundreds of people hanging on her words, waiting to hear what she would say next. "This building," she said, gesturing to the walls around them, "has been the heart of this community for 60 years. It's where we organized voter registration drives when some folks thought we didn't deserve that right. It's where Dr. King spoke about justice and dignity. It's where we planned integration, where we weathered crises, where we celebrated victories. She paused, letting her eyes move across the crowd, seeing faces that represented 5 generations of Clarksdale families. Mr. Morrison wants you to believe that progress means tearing down everything that came before. But real progress honors the past while building the future. Real progress doesn't hide behind shell companies and secret deals. Real progress doesn't try to silence the voices of people who've spent their lives fighting for this community. Marcus had moved closer to the front, his phone capturing everything. Keisha's fingers were flying across her laptop keyboard, live tweeting quotes and uploading photos of the documents. Elena was photographing the crowd's reactions, documenting the moment when everything changed. "So, here's what I propose, Ruby," Mae said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime organizing communities. "We give Mr. Morrison and his investors 30 days to make their real development plans public. Full disclosure of funding sources, complete environmental impact studies, and community input on every aspect of their proposal. If they're really interested in helping Clarksdale, they shouldn't have any problem with transparency." The crowd erupted again, this time in applause. Morrison was trying to speak, but no one was listening. The council members were huddled in desperate conversation. And Ruby Mae Jenkins stood at the podium, 74 years old and more powerful than she'd ever been in her life. As the meeting dissolved into passionate discussions and heated arguments, Ruby Mae gathered her papers and made her way back to her seat. Keisha appeared at her side, eyes bright with pride and amazement. "Grandmama," she whispered. "That was incredible." Ruby Mae smiled, feeling the deep satisfaction of a job well done. "Baby girl, that was just the beginning." Outside, the Mississippi night was warm and full of possibility. Morrison thought he'd been fighting sentiment and nostalgia. He'd just learned the difference between memory and truth, between an old woman and a force of nature. The real battle was about to begin. The attack came at dawn, delivered not with bullets but with headlines. Ruby Mae was making her morning coffee when Keisha burst through the front door, clutching her phone like evidence of a crime. The young woman's face was pale with fury and something that looked like fear. "Grandmama, you need to see this," Keisha said, her voice tight with controlled rage. "Morrison, he's trying to destroy you." She held up her phone, showing the front page of the Clarksdale Tribune's digital edition. The headline made Ruby Mae's stomach clench. Concerned family members question elderly activists' mental state. Ruby Mae sank into her kitchen chair, reading Morrison's carefully crafted response to last night's revelations. The article painted a picture of a confused elderly woman whose family was deeply worried about her recent erratic behavior. Anonymous sources, clearly Morrison's people, suggested that Ruby Mae's accusations were the product of a mind struggling with age-related decline. "Mrs. Jenkins has been exhibiting signs of obsessive behavior and memory confusion," Keisha read aloud, her voice shaking with indignation. "Family members are concerned that she may be experiencing cognitive difficulties that are affecting her judgment about complex municipal planning issues." The cruelty was surgical in its precision. Morrison had weaponized society's worst stereotypes about aging, turning Ruby Mae's greatest vulnerabilities, her age, her status as a widow living alone, into reasons to dismiss everything she'd exposed. "He's not just attacking me," Ruby Mae said quietly, studying the article's carefully chosen words. "He's attacking every elderly person in this community, making their families question whether they should trust their own elders' judgment." The phone rang, and Ruby Mae answered to find Dot Franklin's voice crackling with rage. "Ruby Mae, have you seen—" "I've seen it. That lying, manipulative—" Dot's vocabulary briefly turned unprintable. "He's making you sound like you're wandering around in your nightgown talking to imaginary people." More calls followed, Pastor Washington expressing outrage, Marcus checking if she was okay, Elena promising that the real newspaper would print a correction. But Ruby Mae knew the damage was already spreading through social media. where nuance died and first impressions became permanent truth. By noon, Keisha's phone was buzzing with messages from her Memphis colleagues, tactfully asking if she needed to take family leave to handle the situation. Ruby Mae watched her granddaughter's professional composure crack under the weight of public scrutiny and whispered gossip. "Maybe I should go back to Memphis," Keisha said, staring at her laptop screen where comments ranged from sympathetic to cruel. "Maybe my being here is making it worse for you." "Is that what you want to do?" Keisha's silence was answer enough. Ruby Mae understood. Her granddaughter had built a life based on careful image management and professional reputation. Having that threatened was genuinely terrifying for someone who measured success in likes and client relationships. But before Keisha could respond, another car pulled into Ruby Mae's driveway. This time it was Dot Franklin, moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd declared war. "Ruby Mae!" Dot called, marching up the front steps with a folder under her arm. "We're not taking this lying down." Behind Dot came an unexpected procession. Mrs. Patterson from the Historical Society, Mr. Williams from the barber shop, Mrs. Chen from the garden club, and at least a dozen other seniors Ruby Mae recognized from around town. They moved with the collective determination of people who'd decided they were tired of being dismissed. "Morrison made a mistake," Dot announced, settling into Ruby Mae's living room like a general taking command. "He attacked one of us, which means he attacked all of us, and we're not going to stand for it." Mrs. Patterson, usually soft-spoken and deferential, spoke with uncharacteristic fire. "My husband died of Alzheimer's, and I spent 5 years watching. People treat him like he wasn't there the moment they heard the diagnosis. Morrison is using our worst fears against us. He thinks because we're old, we don't understand social media or public relations," added Mrs. Chen. "He's about to learn how wrong he is." Ruby Mae watched in amazement as her living room transformed into a campaign headquarters. Dot had brought copies of every document they'd researched. Mrs. Patterson had prepared a timeline of the community center's historical significance, and Mrs. Chen had drafted a point-by-point rebuttal to Morrison's allegations. "What about the families he's trying to turn against us?" Ruby Mae asked. "Already handled," Dot said with satisfaction. "I've been calling everyone I know. Mrs. Thompson's daughter drove up from Jackson this morning to make sure her mother wasn't being taken advantage of. Turns out Mrs. Thompson gave her daughter quite an education about underestimating seniors." Marcus appeared at the front door, slightly out of breath. "Mrs. Jenkins, I came as soon as I saw the article. This is complete garbage," finished a new voice. Elena Rodriguez pushed past Marcus, her journalist's instincts clearly engaged. "I've been researching Morrison's sources for this story. Want to guess who his concerned family members are?" She pulled out her phone, showing a photo of Morrison meeting with a middle-aged couple outside City Hall. "Meet the anonymous family sources, Derek Morrison's campaign manager and his wife. They've never spoken to anyone in your family." Keisha looked up from her laptop, her expression shifting from despair to anger. "He fabricated the sources? Completely. It's not just unethical journalism, it's potentially legal defamation." Elena's eyes held the gleam of someone who'd found their target. "Morrison just handed us grounds for a lawsuit and a counter-story that's going to make him look like the desperate liar he is." Ruby Mae felt the familiar electric energy of a well-planned campaign shifting into high gear. Around her living room, representatives of 3 generations were mapping strategy, sharing resources, and proving that underestimating your opposition was always a dangerous mistake. "Morrison thinks he's fighting confused old people," she said, watching Keisha's fingers fly across her keyboard as she began crafting social media responses. "He thinks he can isolate us by making our families doubt us." "What's our response?" asked Pastor Washington, who'd arrived during Elena's revelation about the fabricated sources. Ruby Mae looked around her living room, at Dot's fierce loyalty, at Mrs. Patterson's quiet strength, at Marcus's youthful energy, at Elena's professional competence, at Keisha's growing understanding of what was at stake. Morrison had tried to make her look weak and confused. Instead, he'd awakened something much more dangerous. "Our response," Ruby Mae said, "is to show this community exactly what happens when you attack people who've spent their entire lives learning how to fight back." Dot smiled, her eyes holding the same dangerous gleam they'd carried during integration battles 50 years earlier. "Morrison wanted to question our mental capacity? Let's give him a demonstration of exactly how sharp our minds really are." Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the Mississippi Delta, promising the kind of weather that cleared the air and left everything fresh and clean. Morrison thought he'd delivered a killing blow with his character assassination. He had no idea he'd just united every senior citizen in Clarksdale against him, led by a woman who'd been organizing communities since before he was born. The real counterattack was about to begin. The second community meeting filled the center beyond capacity, with people standing in doorways and crowding outside to peer through windows. But this time, Ruby Mae wasn't facing a room full of uncertain neighbors. She was looking at an audience that had spent 3 days learning exactly how they'd been manipulated, and they were angry. Morrison stood at the podium with the defensive posture of a politician whose carefully laid plans had exploded in his face. Behind him, the 3 council members who'd taken his money sat with the gray pallor of people contemplating the end of their careers. In the back of the room, Elena's camera captured everything while Keisha live-streamed to an audience that had grown from dozens to thousands. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice lacking its usual smooth confidence, "I think there's been some misunderstanding about—" "The only misunderstanding," Ruby Mae interrupted, rising from her front row seat, "is why you thought you could lie to us without consequences." She walked to the podium with the measured pace of someone who held all the cards. Morrison stepped aside reluctantly, his campaign-trained smile looking more like a grimace. "3 days ago," Ruby Mae said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room, "Derek Morrison tried to discredit me by questioning my mental capacity. He planted a story suggesting that my family was concerned about my cognitive decline, that my accusations were the product of confusion and age-related deterioration." She paused, letting her eyes sweep across the audience, seeing faces that reflected 3 generations of Clarksdale families. "Today, I'm going to show him and his investors exactly what a sharp 74-year-old mind can accomplish when it's been underestimated." Dot Franklin stood and moved to join Ruby Mae at the front of the room, carrying a banker's box that she set on the table with deliberate ceremony. "We've spent the last 3 days doing what Derek Morrison hoped we were too old and confused to manage. We've been investigating." Mrs. Patterson rose next, her soft voice carrying surprising steel. "We've been researching property records, tracing shell companies, and following money trails. And what we found goes far beyond municipal corruption." The room was dead silent as Ruby Mae opened the banker's box and pulled out a thick folder. "Morrison's investors haven't just been buying property in Clarksdale. They've been doing the same thing in 12 other small Mississippi towns over the past 5 years. Same shell companies, same pattern of bribing local officials, same promises of economic development that never benefit local residents." She held up photographs and documents that Elena had helped them compile. Biloxi, Vicksburg, Natchez, all of them now host luxury developments that displaced local businesses and priced out longtime residents. All of them were promised jobs and prosperity. None of them received anything but higher property taxes and service industry jobs that pay poverty wages. Morrison tried to interrupt. "Mrs. Jenkins, even if these other projects exist, that doesn't mean—" "It means you're not an economic development specialist," Ruby Mae cut him off. "You're a facilitator for gentrification. Your job is to convince small towns to sell their souls to outside investors who have no interest in preserving communities." She pulled out another document, one that made Morrison's face go ashen. This is your employment contract with Atlantic Investment Group, dated 6 months before you moved back to Clarksdale. Your salary isn't paid by the city. It's paid by the same company that's trying to buy our downtown." The audience erupted in angry voices, but Ruby Mae wasn't finished. She pulled out her final piece of evidence, a photograph that Dot had discovered in her archives. "But here's the part that truly shows what kind of man Derek Morrison is," she said, holding up a 1962 photograph of a young woman standing outside a modest house on Cotton Street. "This is Derek Morrison's grandmother, Evelyn Morrison. She was one of the original organizers who helped plan and fund the construction of this community center." Morrison's face had gone completely white. "How did you—" "She registered voters at this building. She ran the lunch program that fed hungry children during integration. She organized the women's auxiliary that raised money for civil rights, legal challenges." Ruby Mae's voice carried the weight of historical truth. "Your grandmother spent her life building the community you're being paid to destroy." The silence in the room was deafening. Ruby Mae watched Morrison's political facade finally crack completely, revealing the desperate man underneath. "You don't understand," Morrison said, his voice breaking. "I grew up poor in this town, dirt poor. My grandmother worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table. When I got the scholarship to business school, when I got the chance to come back and actually make a difference, by tearing down everything she built?" Pastor Washington's voice rang out from the audience. "By betraying the community that raised you? By bringing real economic opportunity?" Morrison snapped, his composure completely gone. "You want to preserve a building, but what about preserving hope? What about giving young people reasons to stay instead of leaving for better opportunities? What about progress that means more than food stamps and government assistance?" Ruby Mae felt a moment of unexpected sympathy for the man in front of her. She recognized the pain of someone who'd grown up ashamed of his circumstances, desperate to prove himself worthy of respect. But sympathy didn't excuse betrayal. "Your grandmother understood something you've forgotten," she said gently. "Progress that comes at the cost of your community's soul isn't progress at all. It's just another form of oppression." Elena stepped forward from the audience, her camera still recording. "Mr. Morrison, do you have any response to the documentation of bribes paid to council members?" Morrison looked around the room desperately, seeing no allies, no escape routes, no way to spin himself out of the corner he'd been backed into. "The consulting fees were legal," he said weakly. "Legal and corrupt aren't mutually exclusive," Ruby Mae replied. "Just like young and wrong aren't mutually exclusive." The meeting dissolved into chaos as community members demanded answers from the council members, as Morrison's supporters melted away, as the full scope of the deception became clear. But Ruby Mae felt no triumph, only the heavy satisfaction of a job that had needed doing. As people filed out into the warm Mississippi evening, Keisha appeared at her grandmother's side, eyes bright with pride and amazement. "Grandmama, you destroyed him." Ruby Mae looked at Morrison, standing alone near the podium, his political career in ruins, his carefully constructed image shattered. "No, baby girl, he destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone could see it." Outside, Elena was already uploading her story to news outlets across the state. Marcus was fielding calls from other communities that had faced similar development schemes. Pastor Washington was organizing a prayer vigil for healing and reconciliation, and Ruby Mae Jenkins stood in the community center her hands had helped build 60 years ago, surrounded by the proof that some things were worth fighting for, no matter how old you were or how impossible the odds seemed. Morrison thought he'd been fighting nostalgia and sentiment. He'd learned the difference between an old woman and a force of nature. The community center would stand. The question now was whether Derek Morrison could. 2 weeks after Derek Morrison's public downfall, Ruby Mae found him sitting alone on a bench outside the community center at sunset. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of consequences that had followed his exposure. The expensive suits had been replaced by jeans and a faded Delta State t-shirt. The confident politician's bearing had collapsed into the slouched posture of someone who'd lost more than an election. He'd lost his sense of who he was supposed to be. Ruby Mae approached slowly, giving him time to leave if he wanted to avoid the conversation. Instead, Morrison looked up with eyes that held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd spent 2 weeks watching everything he'd built crumble. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said quietly, "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "I wasn't sure either," Ruby Mae admitted, settling onto the bench beside him. "But Dot Franklin found something in her archives that I thought you should have." She pulled out a manila envelope and handed it to him. Morrison opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of photographs and documents from the 1960s. The first image showed a young black woman and an elderly white woman working side by side, sorting donated clothes in what was clearly the community center's main hall. "That's your grandmother, Evelyn Morrison," Ruby Mae said softly. "And that's my mother, working together during the clothing drive for families affected by the Freedom Summer violence." Morrison stared at the photograph, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition to something that looked like grief. I didn't know they knew each other." "They were friends," Ruby Mae continued. "Different backgrounds, different circumstances, but they understood what this building represented. Hope, community, the belief that people could work together across divides that seemed impossible to bridge." She pointed to another photograph, showing Morrison's grandmother teaching children to read in the center's library corner. "Your grandmother volunteered here every Tuesday for 20 years. After you left for college, she used to tell people how proud she was that her grandson was going to come back and help build something even better." Morrison's hands shook as he held the pictures. "She never told me any of this. When I came, back when I told her about the development project, she got quiet, sad. I thought she was getting old, losing track of things." "She wasn't losing track," Ruby Mae said gently. "She was heartbroken. She knew exactly what you were planning to tear down." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sun sink toward the Mississippi horizon. Finally, Morrison spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was so angry when I left this place. Angry at the poverty, at the limitations, at feeling like I had to apologize for where I came from. When Atlantic Investment offered me the scholarship, when they talked about bringing real economic development to small towns like Clarksdale, I thought I was finally going to be the success story this place needed." "What changed?" Ruby Mae asked. Morrison was quiet for a long time. "Nothing changed. That's the problem. I was still that angry kid who thought the only way to prove his worth was to reject everything that made him. I convinced myself that tearing down the old was the only way to build something new." "Your grandmother tried to teach you different." "She tried to teach me a lot of things." Morrison's voice cracked. "About dignity that doesn't depend on wealth, about progress that honors the past, about success that's measured in communities strengthened rather than personal advancement." Ruby Mae studied his profile, seeing past the politician's facade to the hurt young man underneath. "It's not too late to learn those lessons." Morrison turned to her with surprise. "After everything I've done? After the lies, the corruption, the attempt to destroy your reputation? You think there's a path back from this?" "Derek, I spent my adult life working for civil rights in Mississippi. I've seen people change. I've seen enemies become allies, hatred become understanding. I've seen communities heal from wounds that seemed permanent." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But healing requires truth, accountability, and genuine commitment to making amends." "What would that look like?" Ruby Mae pulled out a folder she'd been carrying. "The state attorney general is investigating the corruption charges. You could cooperate fully, help them understand the scope of Atlantic Investments operations in other towns, help protect communities that haven't been exposed yet. Morrison nodded slowly. I've already been talking to them, turning over documents, explaining the process. It's going to mean criminal charges for some people, including me. And I'm ready for that. I should have been honest from the beginning. He looked at the community center, its windows glowing with warm light from the evening programs inside. What about the center? What about the development project? The development project is dead. Atlantic Investment pulled out when the corruption story broke. As for the center? Ruby Mae smiled. The city council voted unanimously to designate it as a historic landmark. No one's tearing it down anytime soon. I'm glad, Morrison said, and Ruby Mae heard genuine relief in his voice. Mrs. Jenkins, I know I don't deserve to ask this, but is there any way I could help? With the center? With the community? Not as a politician or a developer, just as someone who wants to make things right? Ruby Mae studied his face, looking for the sincerity she needed to see. What did you have in mind? I don't know yet. Manual labor, fundraising, administrative work, whatever you need. He paused. I have some money saved up. Not from Atlantic Investment, from before all this started. Maybe it could help with renovations or programs. Money's useful, Ruby Mae said. But the center needs something more valuable than cash. It needs people who understand what it represents, who can help tell its story to new generations. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that. You might be exactly the right person. Someone who made mistakes, who learned from them, who can help others understand why some things are worth preserving. Ruby Mae stood gathering her papers. Think about it. When you're ready, if you're ready, come talk to us. As she walked away, Ruby Mae heard Morrison call after her. Mrs. Jenkins? Why are you giving me this chance? After everything I tried to do to you, to this place? Ruby Mae turned back, her expression holding the wisdom of someone who'd lived through enough conflict to understand the difference between justice and revenge. Because your grandmother would have wanted me to. Because this community is stronger when we help people find their way home rather than driving them away. And because sometimes the people who've made the biggest mistakes are the ones who fight hardest to make things right. Behind her, the community center hummed with activity, children doing homework, seniors playing cards, families gathering for evening meetings. The building stood solid and permanent, its walls holding decades of memories and hope for decades. More to come. Morrison sat alone on the bench, holding photographs of a grandmother he was finally beginning to understand, in the shadow of a building he'd tried to destroy but might now help preserve. The road to redemption was long and uncertain, but Ruby Mae had learned over the years that most worthwhile journeys began with a single step toward truth. Whether Derek Morrison would take that step remained to be seen. But for the first time, since this whole fight began, Ruby Mae believed he might. 6 months later, Ruby Mae stood at the podium in the renovated community center, looking out at an audience that would have been unimaginable when this fight began. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been restored to their original 1963 design, illuminating faces that represented every generation of Clarksdale's history and every shade of its future. Welcome, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had become familiar to people far beyond Mississippi, to the first session of the Clarksdale Community Leadership Institute. In the front row, Marcus Thompson sat with a notebook, already half filled with ideas, his transformation from reluctant college student to passionate community organizer complete. Beside him, Elena Rodriguez adjusted her recording equipment. She was documenting the Institute's launch for a documentary about grassroots democracy that had already garnered national attention. 3 rows back, Derek Morrison took notes with the careful attention of someone still learning to see his hometown through new eyes. His plea agreement had resulted in community service rather than prison time, and he'd chosen to fulfill those hours here, helping coordinate the Institute's technology infrastructure and sharing hard-won knowledge about municipal corruption with other communities facing similar threats. When I was your age, Ruby Mae continued, addressing the dozen young people who'd come from across the Delta to learn community organizing, I thought wisdom was something that automatically came. With experience, I thought if you lived long enough, paid attention hard enough, suffered enough, you'd naturally understand how to make the world better. She paused, her eyes finding Keisha in the middle section. Her granddaughter had indeed moved back to Clarksdale, using her social media expertise to help the center launch programs that bridged digital and traditional organizing methods. More importantly, she'd begun working with Dot Franklin to create an oral history project that was capturing stories from across the region. I was wrong, Ruby Mae said. Wisdom isn't automatic. It's intentional. It requires us to learn from our mistakes, to listen to voices we might prefer to ignore, and to understand that real change happens when different generations work together rather than against each other. Pastor Washington, now serving as the Institute's spiritual advisor, nodded from his seat near the windows. His church had found its voice as a center for social justice, and his sermons had begun drawing audiences from neighboring counties who were hungry for moral leadership that connected faith to community action. The community center we're sitting in today represents more than successful historic preservation, Ruby Mae continued. It represents what happens when people refuse to accept that progress requires erasing the past, when communities choose transparency over corruption, when citizens demand that development serve residents rather than outside investors. She gestured to the walls around them, where new exhibits told the building's story through photographs, documents, and interactive displays that made history accessible to visitors of all ages. But most importantly, it represents what happens when people who've been written off as irrelevant prove that experience, wisdom, and strategic thinking are timeless weapons against injustice. The audience included more than just local residents. Representatives from 12 other Mississippi communities had come to learn about Clarksdale's successful resistance to predatory development. State legislators were studying the model of community-led transparency initiatives. National media had covered the story as an example of effective grassroots organizing in small-town America. Over the next 3 days, Ruby Mae said, you're going to learn practical skills, how to research public records, how to organize community meetings, how to use social media for civic engagement, how to build coalitions across generational and cultural divides. But more than that, you're going to learn something that can't be taught in books or lectures. She looked directly at the young faces in the front rows, seeing in them the same mixture of idealism and uncertainty she'd carried 60 years ago. You're going to learn that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they work together. You're going to learn that being underestimated is often your greatest advantage. And you're going to learn that the most important battles aren't fought by politicians or activists or experts. They're fought by communities that refuse to let other people define their worth or determine their future. The applause was warm and sustained, but Ruby Mae raised her hand for quiet. She had one more thing to say. Before we begin the formal training, I want to share something that Dot Franklin discovered in her archives last week. She held up a yellowed document, handling it with the reverence due to historical treasure. This is the original charter for the Clarksdale Community Center, written in 1963. It includes a mission statement that I think is worth remembering. She put on her reading glasses, though she'd already memorized the words. This center shall serve as a place where all members of our community can gather to learn, organize, celebrate, and plan for a future that honors our past while embracing progress that benefits everyone. It shall stand as long as there are people willing to fight for the principle that community strength comes not from uniformity, but from unity across differences. Ruby Mae folded the document carefully. That was written by people who understood that buildings are just brick and mortar. What makes them matter is the intention behind them. the community that uses them, and the commitment to keep their purpose alive. She stepped away from the podium, but her voice carried clearly through the renewed space. So let's get to work. Let's learn how to fight for our communities. Let's show the world what happens when people decide they're tired of being discounted and start taking their power back. As the audience broke into smaller groups for the first training session, Ruby Mae felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Elena, camera lowered, expression thoughtful. "Ruby Mae, can I ask you something? When this all started, when Morrison first dismissed you at that council meeting, did you know it would lead to all this?" Ruby Mae considered the question, thinking about the journey from that night 6 months ago to this moment of possibility and purpose. "No, baby girl. I knew I had to fight back. My dignity and this building's future depended on it. But I had no idea that fighting back would help me discover what I was really capable of." She looked around the bustling room where Marcus was setting up technology stations, where Derek Morrison was helping elderly participants navigate tablets, where Keisha was interviewing community members for the oral history project, where Pastor Washington was leading a discussion about the intersection of faith and social justice. "I thought this was about saving a building," Ruby Mae continued. "It turned out to be about saving something much more important, the idea that every voice matters, that experience has value, that communities can protect themselves if they're willing to work together." Elena smiled, raising her camera again. "One more question for the documentary. What do you want people to remember about this story?" Ruby Mae thought about Morrison's grandmother, about Dr. King's speech in this very room, about the generations of struggle and hope that had brought them to this moment. She thought about young people like Marcus learning that their elders had wisdom worth listening to, and older people like herself learning that their work wasn't finished just because they'd reached retirement age. "I want them to remember that being told you're too old, too powerless, too irrelevant to matter is usually a sign that you're exactly the person someone fears most. And I want them to remember that some fights are worth having, not just for what you might win, but for who you might become in the process of fighting." Outside, a spring rain was beginning to fall on Clarksdale, washing the streets clean and nourishing the earth for whatever would grow next. The community center hummed with the sound of people learning, planning, and preparing for battles they couldn't yet imagine, but would be ready to fight. Ruby Mae Jenkins had started this journey as a 74-year-old woman whose voice had been dismissed as irrelevant. She was ending it as a teacher, a mentor, and a reminder that the most dangerous underestimation was thinking that age diminished power rather than concentrated it. The building would stand. The community would continue. And somewhere in Mississippi or beyond, another elderly person facing dismissal might remember Ruby Mae's story and decide that they too had something worth fighting for. The lesson was simple but revolutionary. Never underestimate someone who's had a lifetime to learn how to fight back. And never assume that just because someone is old, they're finished changing the world. Ruby Mae Jenkins was 74 years old, and she was just getting started. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.